Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is part 10 of the Ted Bundy series. This is focusing on the trial for Carol DaRonch. Thank you so much for watching this series. If you're not caught up, you can push the pause button. Yeah, I know there's 9 ahead of it, but I don't go back over the same stuff. So you can hit the pause button and we'll be right here when you're caught up. Disclaimer. This is a true crime video series. It is not made for children and it may contain sensitive subject matter. It's November 21st, 1975, and Judge Paul Grant cleared the court for the preliminary hearing in the DaRonch case. Ted had been charged with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal homicide. And Judge Grant heard the testimony of at least a dozen witnesses. Carol DaRonch was one of them. Carol DaRonch took the witness stand for approximately 45 minutes. Now, Bundy was out on bail at this point after spending 7 weeks in jail. And at the recess, he spoke with the reporters about finally being out of jail and compared it to, quote, like being out of a hospital bed. It's nice to walk around again, end quote. And he joked that he told friends that he'd received an 8-week course in criminal procedure. And he was also seen before the hearing calmly reading the novel The Gulag Archipelago. That book is about the author's 8 years in a Soviet prison camp. So the next day, it's still the preliminary hearing. In closed chambers, Judge Grant heard the defense motions to dismiss the charges against Ted. The judge had ordered all the spectators and the news personnel out of the courtroom, and he closed the hearing. Ted was also charged with fraudulent application of a motor vehicle title. In my opinion, these are just add-on charges. Ted had claimed his car title was either lost or stolen when he applied for a duplicate car title, and then he conveyed said title to a bail bondsman. On December 23, 1975, the defense were filing motions to discover how Ted had been identified by Carol DaRonch and the copies of the photographs used to identify him and other discovery evidence. They sought to discover how was she shown the photos and did she fail to ID him? This implied police coercion. Other evidence that was kept out for consideration was that Bundy's blood type O was found on Carol's coat collar. This circumstantial evidence was not to be considered at trial. The judge allowed the defense to see lineup photos used against Ted by the Murray Police Department. The defense contended the lineup was a setup. Quote, the lineup was so unnecessarily suggestive and conducive to irreparable mistaken identification, end quote, and that Ted was denied due process of law due to this. Personally, I don't think the lineup is suggestive. I mean, look at it here. I think he just blends right in with all the other guys here. Doesn't stand out. Meanwhile, on January 9th in Colorado, Detective Fisher was showing a lineup that had Ted in it to a witness, Lesbeth Harder, from the Karen Campbell Wildwood Inn case. And Mrs. Harder picked up Bundy's photo and asked his height, and she said that's the strange man that had been by the elevator. Later on, Mrs. Harder was not able to identify Bundy. So this witness ID ended up falling apart for the Karen Campbell case that was being compiled. Back to the Carol DaRonch prelim, the defense was trying to suppress evidence, and the judge forbade photographers. Again, he banned coverage of the hearing. Judge Hanson, that was a judge now, he was worried about the pretrial publicity, and Judge Hanson was known to be a stickler on the finer points of the law, which is one of the reasons that Ted will end up asking for a bench trial. That means not a jury trial. That means the judge will determine his fate. It's February 9th, 1976, and after Ted had sold the VW, remember the police had vacuumed it? Well, the police re-vacuumed Bundy's VW, and they sent the evidence to the FBI lab. Meanwhile, the FBI had been performing microscopic analysis on the specimen K5. K5 was Karen Campbell's hair sample. They compared her specimen to the contents of the vacuum debris from Ted's Volkswagen, from the trunk and the front floor, and on the floor mat were 2 hairs consistent with Karen Campbell. On February 10th, the police obtained Deborah Kent's hair sample, and then on the 20th, a pubic hair taken from the car will end up microscopically matching Melissa Smith. So a brown pubic hair Q14 was linked or matched to Melissa Smith from the debris from the back seat and the floor. So think, around February 20th, 1975, you have a scalp hair or 1 or 2 matching Karen Campbell, another scalp hair matching Carol DaRonch, and match meaning microscopically indistinguishable. So yeah, all these other cases are starting to build as he is running up to the Carol DaRonch trial. On February 23rd, 1976, the trial begins. Oh, I see here in this picture of Carol DaRonch, I put an E on her name. It does not have an E, but Bundy will later go on to marry a woman that has Carol with an E, so that's why I made that error. I'm sorry about that. Prosecutor David Yoakum of Salt Lake's State's Attorney's Office wanted to avoid a mistrial. So after all, we know Ted's now being clearly eyed as a suspect in other murders. Liz Klepfer, longtime girlfriend of Ted, was standing by her man, even though she called him into the Ted hotline a couple times. She said that Ted was really nervous. And in my opinion, yeah, he was nervous because the hunter had now become the hunted. And as I said before, Ted had wanted a bench trial instead of a jury trial, so he waived his right to a jury trial. And he low-key enjoyed being able to fight his cases, as at this point, it is going to be his only shot at acting as an attorney at this point in his life. Carol DaRonch takes the stand, and she testifies that she had a 1974 maroon Camaro that she parked in the lot at the Fashion Place Mall, and that she'd gone there after work about 7 p.m. to get a birthday present. She went to Walden's bookstore and she ran into her cousin, and then she was window shopping when she was approached by this man, this Officer Roseland. She testified how this Officer Roseland asked her if she'd parked in the Sears parking lot, and he said that someone had tried to break into her car, but then when she went with him to her car, nothing was missing. And as they were walking around, she noticed his clothing and his patent leather shoes. And as they walked to what he called the substation, he asked her age and if she wasn't doing anything later, would she come and file the complaint. They walked all around, so she had plenty of time to talk to him, to look at what he was wearing, to observe him in different lighting situations. He led her to a laundromat, and she was suspicious, but he showed her a badge, and the light beige white VW may have appeared blue under the parking lot light, she admitted, but it was missing its license plate, and she saw rust on the front and the side of the car. She saw stuff on the floor of the passenger side, and that the top back seat was ripped. She got inside and he asked her to put on her seatbelt, but she did tell him no. Ted proceeds to drive, then he makes a U-turn. He pulled over by the McMillan School and he grabbed her arm and slapped a handcuff on it. She lunged for the door and he pulled out a gun. She scrambled out of the car door and he also tumbled out, so he came across the passenger seat along with her and he tried to hit her with a crowbar, which she pushed off. She could feel the crowbar and she was just fighting with him, and her fingernails were all broken, and pictures of her injuries, her fingernails especially, were shown to the jury. And Bundy's car matched the detailed description DaRonch gave of the rust, the dents, and the torn rear seat. On the stand, Carol identified Bundy without hesitation. The question was, where was he seated? Right there. And she pointed right at him. She talked about how she'd talked to him. She'd faced him face to face, and she saw him easily in the lighted parking lot. And it turns out the judge thought Carol made a pretty good witness, even under the fiery cross-examination. Prosecutor Yoakum argued that the gasoline receipts showed that Ted logged 400 miles on the car, traveling in a 3-day period. And, he asked things like, why wasn't, the defendant attending his law classes at the University of Utah? Yoakum later recalled how Bundy was arrogant and always showboating at the trial. He kept calling the prosecutor Dave by his first name. He would later say, quote, "You always sensed he thought he was smarter than anybody in the courtroom," end quote. The police chief and father of victim Melissa Smith also attended the DaRonch trial. He sat in the front row and he stared at Ted. Belva Kent, Deborah Kent's mother, also attended the proceedings and followed him around in the hallway, freaking him out, by the way. After the state rested, the defense argued their case of mistaken identity. Ted took the stand at 10:30 a.m. and he testified that he was attempting to repair his automobile at his Salt Lake City residence, and he wasn't even at the Fashion Place Mall in order to abduct Carol DaRonch. Ted said his car had broken down and he spent the day repairing the VW, and he claimed that night he tried to start it but it wouldn't start. And if the perpetrator brandished a handgun, well, he never even owned a handgun. And, the handcuffs that, were found later in that burglary arrest, he got those from the city dump. And when referring to the burglary tools arrest, Bundy said he was just panicking when the police first approached him because he'd been smoking pot, and that's why he lied about going to a drive-in movie. Ted testified that he drove away from the police in order to ditch his marijuana. Quote, "I'll be darned if I was going to get caught with that stuff in my car," end quote. Ted taking the stand really was a disaster because he was caught up in his own lies, pulling out the marijuana lie, being caught with the burglary tools, and then the handcuffs that matched those used on Carol, and all the silly lies he told to explain all that stuff that was seized. Ted had claimed that his car had not been operational on the date that Carol was abducted, but see, the gas receipts showed differently, that he was driving the wheels off the VW. Ted simply told too many stupid lies. Example, he found the handcuffs at the city dump and he kept them as a curio. The nylon stockings, they were just to keep his face warm under a mask. That crowbar, it's a useful tool. Under cross-examination, the state even got Ted to admit to wearing a false mustache on occasion. Closing arguments were heard on February 27, 1976, and the state argued that there was enough evidence that Ted had abducted Carol DaRonch even without her eyewitness testimony, and that Bundy lied. They argued even if she had died, there was enough evidence to tie him to her kidnapping, but she didn't die. They said she was able to escape her abductor at the Salt Lake County shopping mall on the night of November 8, 1974, and lived to identify pictures of her assailant. She also identified him 3 times in court. The 5-day trial ended around 1 p.m., and Judge Hanson, as the solo juror, then took the case under advisement. Years later, Ted will bitch to law enforcement, Chapman. He said, quote, "Why should Carol DaRonch screw up my life? She just got lucky." And then Chapman said, "How's she lucky?" And Ted said, "She got away." February 29, 1976, Judge Hanson was still pondering his decision on Ted's fate. The judge had not reached his final decision until March 1st, 1976. The judge found Ted guilty of attempting to abduct Carol DaRonch and aggravated kidnapping. Ted remained motionless as the judge handed down his verdict before a hushed courtroom. Ted was immediately handcuffed. Liz Klepfer sat with him and his parents, and she felt that it was a travesty of justice. After the verdict, he was allowed a moment with his parents and with Liz. Liz was still backing Ted, and she was regretting speaking with the authorities. The judge said that he would sentence Ted on March 22nd. But meanwhile, on March 11th, Ted was questioned by Detective Fisher and Baldridge in the Salt Lake County Jail, and he had his counsel, John O'Connell, there. The detectives wanted to ask Ted about Karen Campbell and other instances where he was in places where girls went missing. Ted was shown his January 12th gas receipt, and Ted said, "It appears to be my signature." Ted said that he didn't recall being in Glenwood when he was then shown gas receipts for both the 11th and the 12th. And then he surmised that the purpose of the trip, had he gone there, would have been to get out of Salt Lake and to get away from the pressure of law exams. When asked about Grand Junction, Ted admitted to passing through it once, looking for a gas station. On March 23, 1976, Judge Hanson delayed Ted's sentencing in the DaRonch trial until a psych eval could be complete. I kind of think Judge Hanson was a lot like a lot of true crime junkies in a way that he sought to understand why an intelligent student like Ted would do such an act. He was looking deeper into this thing. Since the pre-sentencing report contained insufficient information, the judge ordered a 90-day diagnostics exam. So Ted then met with psychiatrists, he met with psychologists, he had his skull x-rayed, he had brain scans, he had tests. Ted's IQ was calculated at 122, which was very superior intelligence. One psych eval performed by Dr. Evan Lewis noted that Ted only lost his composure when talking about his mother. It was also noted that Ted was good at compartmentalization and that he showed a lack of guilt and he was callous. One report noted, quote, "The crimes against women attributed to him are most likely of a calculated nature and not of an irrational or uncontrollable origin," end quote. In conclusion, I feel that Mr. Bundy is either a man who has no problems or is smart enough and clever enough to appear close to the edge of normal. Dr. Al Carlisle also spoke with Ted, and Ted asked him, "Do you really think I killed these girls?" And Dr. Carlisle responded, "If you did, you'll do it again." And if Judge Hanson had any reservations about his previous sentencing, during the diagnostic exam during this time period, the FBI came back with a match. A hair matching Carol DaRonch was found from the vacuumed contents from the VW. And the judge thought to himself, well, the county won its case without its best piece of evidence. So on June 30th, 1976, Ted was sentenced by the judge to the Utah State Prison to serve between 1 and 15 years. Coincidentally, this would give the authorities time to solidify the other cases against him, like the Karen Campbell case. But it turns out that Ted was impatient. He couldn't wait to serve 1 to 15 years. Actually, this was really stupid. More than likely, he would have served about a year and gotten out. But Ted knew what he had done elsewhere. He knew they were building cases against him. And so guess what? He escapes. So if you found this interesting, if you found this edifying, please hit the like button. Please hit the subscribe bell. And I'll be back with episode 11. Without further ado, have an excellent day. Bye.